What happened at the Eagle Pride Festival that October afternoon would become the most talked about incident in Millbrook's history. When Tyler Brennan, the mayor's spoiled son and star quarterback, decided to humiliate the quiet wrestling coach's wife in front of 800 community members. He had no idea he was about to meet someone who had once dominated opponents on wrestling mats across 3 states. This is the story of Jessica Martinez and why some people should never mistake kindness for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air carried the scent of caramel apples and kettle corn across the sprawling grounds of Millbrook Central High School as Jessica Martinez stepped out of her husband's pickup truck. The Eagle Pride Festival was in full swing, transforming the usually quiet campus into a carnival of community spirit and fundraising enthusiasm. Families streamed through the main gates, children clutching balloons and cotton candy, while teenagers clustered around game booths and food trucks with the casual confidence that only comes with being on familiar territory. Jess smoothed down her simple navy cardigan and adjusted the strap of her worn leather purse, taking in the controlled chaos with the careful observation of someone who preferred watching to participating. At 28, she had learned to navigate social situations with the same methodical approach she brought to her work as a physical therapist. Observe first, assess the dynamics, then move with purpose. It was a strategy that had served her well through 3 years of marriage to David Martinez, Millbrook's wrestling coach, and the delicate process of becoming part of a tight-knit community that had known each other since childhood. The festival represented everything Millbrook prided itself on, a carefully orchestrated display of suburban prosperity and school spirit. Local businesses had sponsored elaborate booths, the marching band played patriotic songs from a makeshift stage, and the smell of grilled burgers mingled with the sweet aroma of funnel cakes. Parents in expensive athletic wear chatted easily with neighbors while keeping one eye on their children, and teenagers moved in carefully choreographed social groups that spoke to years of established hierarchies. Jess had grown up in a different world entirely. Her childhood in rural Ohio had been marked by early mornings in the wrestling room, the constant ache of pushing her body beyond its limits, and the singular focus required to excel in a sport that demanded everything and promised nothing in return. While other girls her age were discovering makeup and dating, Jess had been learning the ancient art of leverage and control, understanding that true strength came not from size or aggression, but from technique, timing, and the mental fortitude to keep fighting when your body wanted to quit. The injury that ended her competitive career during her senior year at Ohio State had been devastating in ways she still struggled to articulate. One moment she was drilling takedowns with the intensity of someone who had Olympic aspirations, and the next she was lying on a hospital bed listening to a surgeon explain why her wrestling career was over. The rehabilitation process had been grueling, not just physically, but emotionally, as she learned to rebuild her identity around something other than the sport that had defined her for nearly 2 decades. Meeting David had been the unexpected blessing that emerged from that dark period. He was completing his teaching certification while working as an assistant wrestling coach, and their shared understanding of the sport's demands had created an immediate connection. More importantly, he saw past her quiet exterior to recognize the competitor that still burned beneath the surface, even as she convinced herself that part of her life was permanently in the past. Their move to Millbrook 3 years ago had been motivated by David's opportunity to take over a struggling wrestling program and Jess's chance to establish her own practice at the town's rehabilitation clinic. The community had welcomed David enthusiastically, recognizing his potential to bring respectability to a program that had been mediocre for years. Jess, however, remained something of an enigma to the locals. She was friendly but reserved, supportive of her husband's work, but content to remain in the background, present at wrestling matches, but never seeking attention or recognition. This approach had worked well until recently, when David's success began to shift the delicate balance of power that governed Millbrook's social ecosystem. The wrestling team's improved performance had started to attract resources and attention previously monopolized by the football program, and that shift had not gone unnoticed by those who benefited from the existing order. Tyler Brennan represented everything that was both admirable and troubling about Millbrook's youth culture. At 17, he possessed the kind of natural charisma and athletic ability that made success seem effortless, backed by the financial resources and family connections that ensured obstacles were swiftly removed from his path. His father, Mayor Tom Brennan, owned 3 successful businesses in town and wielded the kind of influence that made phone calls to school administrators both effective and frequent. Tyler's relationship with Coach Martinez had been cordial but increasingly strained as the wrestling program's success highlighted the football team's recent struggles. The quarterback position that Tyler had dominated for 2 seasons was becoming less secure as his grades slipped and his attitude toward authority grew more cavalier. The fact that several football players had been cut from the team for disciplinary issues while the wrestling team maintained strict standards had created a resentment that Tyler was not equipped to process maturely. Jess had become aware of this tension gradually through small comments from David and observations at school events. Tyler's discomfort with anyone he couldn't charm or intimidate was becoming more apparent, and his circle of friends had begun to adopt his increasingly hostile attitude toward perceived threats to their social supremacy. They moved through Millbrook like young royalty, confident in their invulnerability and increasingly creative in their methods of maintaining dominance. The wrestling team's recent victory in the school's annual fundraising competition had been the final insult to Tyler's sense of natural order. The fact that a group of disciplined athletes under Coach Martinez's leadership had outperformed the football program in generating community support was unacceptable, and Tyler had spent the past week making his displeasure known through increasingly aggressive social media posts and public comments. As Jess made her way through the festival crowd, she was acutely aware of the social currents flowing around her. The wrestling team had set up a demonstration booth near the main stage, where David was explaining techniques to curious parents and potential future wrestlers. The display was drawing impressive crowds, with young athletes eager to learn from a coach whose methods were producing visible results. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The football team's presence at the festival was more scattered and less organized, reflecting both their recent struggles and the entitled assumption that their popularity was guaranteed, regardless of performance. Tyler and his core group of friends had claimed territory near the food trucks, where they could observe and comment on the proceedings while maintaining their image as the school's unofficial social arbiters. Jess had planned to spend the afternoon supporting David's demonstration and helping with the team's fundraising efforts, but she found herself drawn to observe the larger dynamics at play. The festival represented Millbrook in microcosm, with its careful balance of tradition and progress, its underlying tensions between different social groups, and its unspoken understanding that certain people were expected to know their place. What she didn't anticipate was becoming the focal point of those tensions herself. Tyler's increasing frustration with the wrestling program's success had begun to focus on symbols and representatives rather than direct confrontation with Coach Martinez, who commanded too much respect for a frontal assault. Jess, however, represented a different kind of target, someone who could be attacked without the immediate professional consequences that would follow any challenge to her husband's authority. The morning had started promisingly enough, with David excited about the opportunity to showcase his team's skills and Jess looking forward to a rare day when she could simply be a supportive wife rather than maintaining the careful professional demeanor required at the clinic. She had chosen her outfit carefully, opting for clothing that was both respectable and practical, suitable for a day of standing and potentially helping with demonstrations. Her simple navy cardigan covered a white blouse paired with a knee-length khaki skirt that allowed for movement while maintaining the conservative appearance expected of a coach's wife. The outfit was unremarkable by design, chosen to blend in rather than attract attention, but it would soon become the center of an incident that would change everything about how Millbrook viewed both her and the carefully maintained social order that governed their community. As she approached the wrestling booth, Jess could see David in his element, demonstrating a basic takedown for a group of middle school boys whose eyes lit up with the possibility of learning something that looked both impressive and achievable. The sight brought a smile to her face, reminding her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. His passion for teaching and his genuine belief in the sport's ability to build character were infectious, and watching him work confirmed her decision to support his career, even when it meant accepting a more peripheral role for herself. The first sign of trouble came as a shift in the crowd's energy, a subtle change in the background noise that her years of competitive experience had trained her to recognize. Conversations became slightly louder, laughter took on a harder edge, and people began to position themselves as if anticipating entertainment rather than education. Jess turned to identify the source of the disturbance and saw Tyler Brennan approaching with his usual entourage, their swagger and volume marking them as clearly as a uniform. The group moved with the casual arrogance of teenagers who had never faced meaningful consequences for their actions, secure in their understanding that Millbrook's social and economic hierarchy would protect them from any serious repercussions. They were not necessarily malicious by nature, but they had been shaped by a system that rewarded their worst impulses while insulating them from the natural consequences of their behavior. Tyler's appearance at the wrestling demonstration was not coincidental. He had spent the morning moving through the festival with increasing agitation, watching the positive response to Coach Martinez's program and the respectful attention being paid to activities that challenged his team's assumed supremacy. The wrestling booth's success represented everything he found threatening about changing dynamics in Millbrook's power structure. Jess recognized the signs immediately. She had seen this kind of predatory behavior before, both in competitive settings where psychological warfare was part of the game, and in clinical situations where she worked with athletes whose careers had been derailed by their inability to handle adversity constructively. Tyler was looking for a way to reassert control, and the most effective method would be to target someone associated with his perceived threat who couldn't fight back effectively. The calculation in his approach was almost visible as he assessed the situation and identified Jess as the ideal target. She was connected to Coach Martinez, but not protected by professional status, visible enough to make an impact, but isolated enough to be vulnerable, and female in a way that his twisted logic suggested would make her less likely to respond with effective resistance. What Tyler couldn't possibly know was that his target assessment was fundamentally flawed. The quiet woman in the conservative outfit watching her husband demonstrate wrestling techniques was not the helpless victim he imagined. She was someone who had spent years learning to read opponents, to recognize the moment when conflict became inevitable, and to respond with the kind of controlled violence that ended confrontations definitively. Jess felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that preceded competition, the heightened awareness that came when peaceful resolution was no longer possible and preparation for conflict became necessary. She had hoped that part of her life was finished, that marriage and career and the comfortable routine of small-town life would provide sufficient distance from the world where such skills were required. But as Tyler Brennan closed in with his predatory smile and his followers arranged themselves for maximum impact, Jess realized that some lessons, once learned, could never be completely forgotten. The question was not whether she still possessed the skills that had once made her a formidable competitor, but whether she would be forced to use them in front of 800 people who thought they knew exactly who she was. The information came in fragments over the following weeks, each piece adding to a picture that Jess wished she didn't have to assemble. David would come home from school with stories that he tried to frame as minor irritations, but Jess could read the frustration in the way he set down his coffee cup too hard or spent extra time organizing papers that were already perfectly arranged. The wrestling program's success was creating unexpected complications, and Tyler Brennan was at the center of most of them. It started with scheduling conflicts that seemed innocent enough until the pattern became clear. The football team suddenly needed the wrestling room for emergency conditioning sessions, always at times that interfered with the wrestlers' training schedule. The weight room, which had been shared between programs for years without incident, developed new usage policies that heavily favored football players. Equipment that had been ordered for the wrestling team disappeared into storage, waiting for budget approvals that never seemed to come. Sarah Henderson, who worked in the school's main office, lived 2 houses down from the Martinez family and had become Jess's primary source of information about the administrative maneuvering happening behind closed doors. Sarah had been at Millbrook Central for 15 years and understood the delicate ecosystem of favors, pressure, and influence that really determined how decisions were made. During their morning walks around the neighborhood, she would share details that painted a concerning picture of coordinated effort to undermine David's program. The school board meetings had become increasingly contentious, though the public minutes reflected none of the actual tension. Tom Brennan's presence at these meetings was technically in his capacity as mayor, but his questions and comments consistently focused on athletic department spending and the wisdom of expanding successful programs at the expense of traditional powerhouses. Sarah had heard him on multiple phone calls with other board members discussing budget reallocations and coaching contracts with the kind of specificity that suggested extensive research and planning. Tyler's behavior at school was becoming more brazen as his frustration with his father's political approach grew. The quarterback, who had once been content to let his natural talents speak for themselves, was now actively campaigning against anyone associated with the wrestling program. Football players who showed interest in wrestling techniques found themselves excluded from social events and facing increased hazing during practice. Teachers who praised the wrestling team's academic performance received complaints about their fairness and objectivity. The social media campaign was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Tyler's strategy. He had cultivated an image as Millbrook's golden boy, documenting his charitable activities and community involvement with the same attention to detail that a professional publicist might employ. This carefully constructed persona gave weight to his more subtle attacks on Coach Martinez and the wrestling program, framing criticism in terms of concern for school unity and resource allocation. Madison Hartwell, Tyler's girlfriend, had proven particularly effective at spreading doubt through the network of parents and community members who followed her Instagram account religiously. Her posts about school events consistently highlighted football activities while ignoring wrestling achievements, creating a skewed narrative about which programs truly represented Millbrook's values. When she did mention wrestling, it was always in the context of questioning whether the sport's aggressive nature was appropriate for a school focused on academic excellence. The financial pressure was becoming more concrete as well. 3 significant Donors to the athletic department had quietly indicated that their continued support was contingent on maintaining football's primacy in the school's priorities. These weren't explicit threats, but rather the kind of subtle communication that experienced fundraisers understood immediately. The wrestling program's budget requests, which had seemed reasonable when the team was mediocre, were now being scrutinized with the intensity typically reserved for major capital expenditures. Jess found herself researching Tyler Brennan with the same methodical approach she brought to diagnosing complex physical therapy cases. What she discovered was both predictable and troubling. Tyler's academic record showed a pattern of grades that improved dramatically whenever his athletic eligibility was in question, suggesting a level of institutional protection that extended far beyond normal student support. His disciplinary file, which Sarah had discreetly mentioned, contained incidents that would have resulted in serious consequences for students without his connections. The most concerning information came from Jennifer Walsh, a nurse at the local emergency room who had treated several students over the past 2 years. She couldn't provide specific details due to privacy regulations, but her carefully worded comments during a chance encounter at the grocery store suggested that Tyler's circle of friends had been involved in incidents that never resulted in official reports or police involvement. The pattern of protection extended beyond academic and athletic spheres into areas where real harm was being covered up by influential families. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the school's principal, had been walking an increasingly difficult tightrope as pressure mounted from multiple directions. She respected Coach Martinez's work and recognized the positive impact his program was having on student discipline and academic performance. But she also understood the political realities that governed her position. 3 board members had already expressed concerns about her leadership style, and alienating the Brennan family could easily provide the justification needed for her replacement. The wrestling team members themselves were beginning to feel the pressure in ways that affected their performance and morale. Marcus Williams, a sophomore who had shown exceptional promise early in the season, suddenly found himself failing chemistry, despite previously solid grades. When his parents investigated, they discovered that his lab partner assignments had been changed multiple times, always pairing him with students who were either unwilling or unable to contribute effectively to group projects. Kevin Rodriguez, the team captain and David's most reliable leader, was experiencing problems with his part-time job at a local restaurant owned by one of Tom Brennan's business associates. His work schedule had been dramatically reduced without explanation, creating financial pressure for a family that depended on his income. When Kevin asked about the change, he was told that business was slow, despite the restaurant being consistently busy whenever he observed it from outside. The psychological pressure was perhaps the most effective tool in Tyler's arsenal. School social dynamics had always been complex, but Tyler's systematic campaign to isolate wrestling team members was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. Football players who had been friends with wrestlers since elementary school suddenly had no time for those relationships. Party invitations dried up, study groups became exclusive, and the casual social interactions that made high school bearable disappeared for anyone associated with the wrestling program. Jess watched David struggle with these developments while trying to maintain the positive attitude that had made him an effective coach. He believed in addressing problems through honest communication and hard work, approaches that were completely inadequate for dealing with the kind of coordinated political assault Tyler and his father were orchestrating. David's instinct was to focus on wrestling and let the results speak for themselves. But Jess could see that strategy becoming less viable as the external pressure increased. The breaking point for Jess's patience came when she overheard a conversation at the physical therapy clinic that revealed the true scope of the campaign against her husband. Mrs. Patricia Rothschild, whose son played football, was discussing the wrestling program with Mrs. Elizabeth Shaw, a prominent real estate agent whose daughter was on the cheerleading squad. Their conversation, which they assumed was private, laid out the coordinated nature of the effort to remove Coach Martinez from his position. According to Mrs. Rothschild, Tom Brennan had been building a case for months about the wrestling program's negative impact on school culture. The argument was sophisticated and well-researched, focusing on concerns about injury rates, the sport's aggressive nature, and questions about whether wrestling aligned with Millbrook's academic priorities. The financial argument was particularly compelling, suggesting that resources devoted to wrestling could be better utilized, supporting programs with broader community appeal. Mrs. Shaw's contribution to the conversation revealed the social pressure component of the strategy. She had been tasked with organizing a group of concerned parents who would request a review of all athletic programs, with particular attention to coaching effectiveness and program sustainability. The request would appear to come from grassroots, a parent concern, but the timing and specific language had been carefully coordinated to support the administrative case against David's continued employment. The conversation also revealed Tyler's role in gathering information that could be used against individual wrestling team members. He had been documenting disciplinary incidents, academic struggles, and personal problems that could be attributed to the stress and time demands of wrestling participation. The goal was to build a comprehensive case that the wrestling program was harming students rather than helping them, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Jess realized that she was witnessing something more complex than typical high school sports rivalry. This was a sophisticated political operation designed to eliminate a perceived threat to established power structures, and it was being executed with resources and coordination that David couldn't match through conventional means. The wrestling program's success had inadvertently challenged assumptions about natural hierarchy in Millbrook, and the response was designed to restore the previous order through any means necessary. The most disturbing aspect of the campaign was its effectiveness in isolating David from potential allies. Teachers who respected his work were reluctant to speak publicly in support of the wrestling program for fear of being identified as opponents of the football team and its influential supporters. Parents who appreciated the positive impact wrestling had on their children were hesitant to challenge families whose social and economic connections could affect their own standing in the community. Even within the athletic department, support for David was becoming more qualified and cautious. Coach Williams, who led the football program, had initially maintained a collegial relationship with David, despite the growing competition for resources. However, pressure from influential boosters and Tom Brennan's direct conversations with athletic department administrators had made neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. The superintendent, Dr. Michael Chen, found himself in an impossible position as pressure mounted from multiple directions. Tom Brennan's influence extended well beyond Millbrook Central High School into county and state educational politics, making him a dangerous enemy for any administrator with career ambitions. The wrestling program's success was undeniable, but success that created political problems was sometimes less valuable than mediocrity that maintained stability. As Jess processed this information, she began to understand that the eventual confrontation with Tyler was not going to be an isolated incident between teenagers. It was part of a larger struggle about power, privilege, and the right of established elites to maintain their dominance without challenge. Tyler's personal antipathy toward the wrestling program was real, but it was amplified and supported by adult interests that saw David's success as a threat to carefully maintained arrangements. The research phase also revealed Tyler's personal vulnerabilities and the psychology driving his increasingly aggressive behavior. Academic pressure from his father had intensified as college recruitment approached, creating stress that Tyler was handling poorly. His quarterback position, which had once seemed secure, was becoming more tenuous as his performance declined and younger players showed greater dedication and skill. The social dominance that had always come naturally was requiring more effort to maintain, particularly as other students began to question whether athletic ability automatically conferred leadership credentials. Madison Hartwell's influence on Tyler was becoming more apparent as well. Her own insecurities about maintaining social status had made her a driving force behind many of the more vicious social media attacks on wrestling team members and their families. Her fear of losing her position as Millbrook's premier teenage socialite had led to increasingly desperate attempts to reinforce the hierarchies that supported her status. The information gathering also revealed potential allies who might support the wrestling program if they felt safe doing so. Several teachers had privately expressed admiration for David's coaching methods and the positive changes they observed in student behavior. Parents whose children had benefited from wrestling participation were grateful but afraid to speak publicly. Even some students from other sports programs respected the wrestling team's dedication and achievements, though they were reluctant to challenge the social pressure against expressing such views. Understanding the landscape of support and opposition allowed Jess to begin formulating strategies for protecting her husband's program and potentially neutralizing the coordinated attack. However, she also recognized that traditional approaches like committee meetings, parent conferences, and administrative appeals were unlikely to be effective against opponents who controlled those very processes. The intelligence-gathering phase culminated with Jess's realization that Tyler's campaign against the wrestling program was escalating toward a direct confrontation that would force the community to choose sides publicly. His frustration with the slow pace of political and administrative pressure was leading him toward more dramatic actions that would create the kind of crisis his father could exploit to justify extreme measures. Tyler's psychology, as Jess understood it from observation and research, required public victory to maintain his self-image and social position. Private accommodation or compromise would not satisfy his need to demonstrate dominance, particularly given the audience of peers and adults whose respect he desperately needed to maintain. The upcoming Eagle Pride Festival represented the perfect opportunity for Tyler to create a public incident that would humiliate Coach Martinez and his supporters while positioning himself as the defender of Millbrook's traditional values. Jess's competitive background had taught her to recognize the signs of an opponent preparing for decisive action, and everything about Tyler's recent behavior suggested that he was building toward a confrontation that would determine the future of her husband's career and their life in Millbrook. The question was not whether such a confrontation would occur, but when and how, and whether she would be prepared to respond effectively when it did. The systematic harassment campaign revealed itself gradually, like a complex chess strategy, becoming apparent only after multiple moves had been executed. Tyler Brennan's approach to psychological warfare demonstrated a sophistication that spoke to both his natural cunning and the guidance he was receiving from adults who understood how to destroy reputations methodically. What had initially appeared to be random acts of teenage cruelty was actually a coordinated assault designed to isolate Coach Martinez and his supporters while building justification for administrative action. The locker room incidents started, small and escalated systematically. Wrestling team members would arrive to find their gear missing, their locks cut, or their personal belongings scattered across the floor. The vandalism was always just serious enough to be disruptive, but not quite severe enough to justify police involvement, particularly given the athletic department's preference for handling disciplinary issues internally. Security camera footage from the affected areas consistently experienced technical problems or showed conveniently timed blind spots that prevented identification of the perpetrators. Jason Torres, a junior wrestler whose academic performance had improved dramatically, since joining the team, suddenly found himself struggling with mysterious grade changes and missing assignments. His English teacher, Mrs. Coleman, seemed genuinely confused when Jason questioned discrepancies between his submitted work and the grades recorded in her gradebook. Computer glitches were blamed for the problems, but the pattern of errors consistently affected wrestlers while leaving other students' records intact. The social media component of the harassment was particularly sophisticated, utilizing fake accounts and coordinated posting to create the appearance of widespread community concern about the wrestling program. Negative reviews appeared on the school's social media pages. Anonymous complaints were filed with the school board, and carefully edited video clips of wrestling practices were shared with commentary about the sport's violent nature and potential for injury. Madison Hartwell had recruited a network of female students to participate in the campaign, targeting wrestling team members' girlfriends and female family members with rumors, social exclusion, and online harassment. The attacks were designed to create relationship stress and family pressure that would ultimately affect the wrestlers' performance and commitment to the team. Parents who had initially supported their son's wrestling participation began questioning whether the social costs were worth the athletic benefits. Tyler's inner circle expanded to include students from other sports programs who resented the wrestling team's success and the resources being directed toward David's program. Basketball players complained about scheduling conflicts. Track athletes questioned equipment allocations, and even tennis team members found themselves drawn into discussions about the wrestling program's negative impact on school athletics. The coalition building was sophisticated and effective, creating the appearance of broad-based opposition to Coach Martinez's leadership. The academic pressure intensified as teachers friendly to the Brennan family found reasons to scrutinize wrestling team members more closely than other students. Attendance policies were enforced more strictly. Assignment deadlines became less flexible, and group project assignments consistently placed wrestlers with partners who were either hostile or uncooperative. The grade point average requirements for athletic eligibility, which had been enforced loosely in previous years, suddenly became rigid barriers that threatened several team members' continued participation. Financial pressure extended beyond the school environment into the broader community, as local businesses aligned with the Brennan family interests began finding reasons to terminate employment or reduce hours for wrestling families. Part-time jobs that had provided crucial income for working-class families suddenly became unavailable. Scholarship opportunities dried up, and even service appointments at family businesses were delayed or cancelled without explanation. The psychological toll on David became increasingly apparent as he struggled to maintain team morale while addressing an endless series of manufactured crises. His natural optimism and faith in institutional fairness were being systematically exploited by opponents who understood that his ethical approach to conflict resolution made him vulnerable to coordinated, unethical attacks. Every attempt to address problems through proper channels resulted in delays, investigations, and ultimately decisions that favored his opponents. Jess watched her husband absorb increasingly personal attacks while maintaining his commitment to positive coaching and fair play. David's refusal to engage in retaliatory behavior was admirable, but tactically disadvantageous when facing opponents who recognized no ethical constraints. His belief that hard work and good results would ultimately prevail was being tested by Adversaries who understood that perception often mattered more than reality in determining institutional support. The documentation of harassment incidents became Jess's obsession as she recognized the need to build a comprehensive record of the coordinated campaign against her family. She began photographing damaged equipment, saving screenshots of social media attacks, and maintaining detailed logs of incidents that individually seemed minor but collectively revealed a clear pattern of systematic intimidation. Dr. Foster's position became increasingly precarious as pressure mounted from board members, influential parents, and community leaders who questioned her ability to maintain order and unity within the school environment. Her attempts to investigate harassment complaints were consistently frustrated by lack of evidence, witness reluctance, and the sophisticated nature of the attacks that left few traceable connections to their actual perpetrators. The wrestling team's performance began to suffer as external pressure affected concentration, preparation, and team chemistry. Wrestlers who had been making steady progress found themselves distracted by academic problems, family stress, and social isolation that made competition seem less important than simply surviving the daily challenges of attending Millbrook Central. The decline in results provided Tyler's supporters with evidence that the program was failing and that coaching changes might be necessary. Community meetings about athletic department policies became forums for expressing carefully orchestrated concerns about wrestling's impact on school culture. Parents who had never shown interest in athletics suddenly became passionate advocates for reviewing coaching effectiveness and program sustainability. The language used in these discussions was sophisticated and focused, suggesting coordination and preparation that went far beyond spontaneous community concern. Local media coverage began reflecting the narrative that Tyler's supporters were promoting, with stories about wrestling team incidents receiving prominent coverage while positive achievements were minimized or ignored entirely. The weekly newspapers, sports coverage, which had previously provided balanced reporting on all school athletic programs, began emphasizing football activities while treating wrestling as a secondary concern worthy of only brief mentions. The harassment campaign's effectiveness lay not just in its direct impact on targeted individuals, but in its success at intimidating potential supporters into silence. Teachers, parents, and community members who privately supported Coach Martinez and the wrestling program became reluctant to express those views publicly for fear of becoming targets themselves. The culture of fear that Tyler and his allies created was perhaps their most powerful weapon in isolating their opponents. Tyler's personal involvement in the harassment became more direct as his frustration with the slow pace of change intensified. He began appearing at wrestling practices, ostensibly to use shared facilities, but actually to observe and document anything that could be used against the program. His presence was disruptive and clearly intended to intimidate, but his careful adherence to technical rules made formal complaints difficult to pursue effectively. The relationship between Tyler and his father became a crucial element in escalating the harassment campaign beyond typical teenage behavior. Tom Brennan's political experience and business connections provided resources and strategic guidance that transformed adolescent social conflict into sophisticated character assassination. The mayor's ability to apply pressure through official channels while maintaining plausible deniability was crucial to the campaign's effectiveness. Madison Hartwell's role evolved from passive supporter to active coordinator, as she recognized the social benefits of being associated with Tyler's campaign against perceived outsiders. Her natural talent for manipulation and her extensive social media following made her an ideal lieutenant in efforts to shape community opinion and isolate wrestling supporters. Her willingness to use personal information obtained through friendship, And confidence made her particularly dangerous to other teenage girls in wrestling families. The harassment campaign reached its most sophisticated level with the development of false flag operations designed to make wrestling team members appear to be the aggressors in conflicts they were actually victims of. Incidents were staged and documented to create evidence of wrestling program members engaging in exactly the kind of behavior they were being accused of promoting. The psychological impact of being blamed for problems they didn't create was devastating to teenage athletes who lacked the experience to understand such complex manipulation. Jess's realization that traditional defensive strategies were inadequate for dealing with Tyler's coordinated assault led her to begin developing more proactive approaches to protecting her husband's program and their family's future in Millbrook. The intelligence-gathering phase had revealed both the scope of the threat they faced and the sophisticated resources arrayed against them, making clear that conventional responses through proper channels would be insufficient to counter the political and social warfare being waged against them. The systematic nature of the harassment campaign also revealed Tyler's psychological profile and strategic weaknesses that could potentially be exploited if direct confrontation became necessary. His need for public validation, his dependence on group support for confidence, and his inexperience with genuine resistance created vulnerabilities that someone with Jess's competitive background was uniquely qualified to identify and potentially exploit. As the harassment campaign intensified and its effects on David's program became more apparent, Jess began preparing mentally for the possibility that peaceful resolution might not be achievable. Her research into Tyler's psychology and methods had convinced her that he was building toward a public confrontation that would force the community to choose sides definitively, and she recognized that her response to such a confrontation could determine not just her family's future, but the broader question of whether privilege and coordination could permanently silence merit and hard work in Millbrook's social ecosystem. The tension in Millbrook reached a breaking point during the week leading up to the Eagle Pride Festival. What had been simmering beneath the surface of polite community discourse finally erupted into open conflict as Tyler Brennan's campaign against the wrestling program escalated beyond subtle manipulation into direct confrontation. The carefully maintained facade of civilized disagreement crumbled as personal attacks became public spectacles and the true nature of the power struggle became impossible to ignore. David came home on Wednesday evening with news that crystallized the threat facing his program. The school board had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss concerns about athletic department resources and program effectiveness. A euphemism that everyone understood meant a formal review of his coaching position. Tom Brennan had successfully orchestrated enough pressure to force institutional action, and the meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, just 3 days after the Eagle Pride Festival. The timing was not coincidental. Tyler had been building toward a public confrontation that would provide his father with the final piece of evidence needed to justify David's removal. The festival represented the perfect opportunity to create an incident that would demonstrate the wrestling program's negative impact on school culture, while positioning Tyler as the defender of Millbrook's traditional values. Jess recognized the trap immediately. Tyler's psychology required public victory to satisfy his need for dominance, and his father's political strategy demanded a dramatic incident that would justify administrative action. The festival's community-wide attendance would ensure maximum visibility for whatever confrontation Tyler was planning, while the informal atmosphere would make it difficult for David to maintain the professional demeanor that had protected him thus far. The weekend before the festival brought a series of incidents that felt like psychological warfare designed to exhaust the wrestling team's emotional reserves before the main event. Kevin Rodriguez found his car vandalized in the school parking lot with wrestling-related graffiti that was clearly intended to make the incident appear related to team activities. Marcus Williams received threatening text messages from anonymous numbers, warning him about the consequences of continuing to support Coach Martinez. Social media exploded with coordinated attacks as Tyler's supporters launched a comprehensive assault on the wrestling program's reputation. Fake accounts shared manipulated photos and videos designed to make team members appear violent and out of control. Anonymous posts on community forums spread rumors about drug use, academic cheating, and behavioral problems that were entirely fabricated but presented with enough detail to seem credible. The psychological pressure on Jess intensified as she became a specific target of increasingly personal attacks. Someone had researched her background extensively, uncovering details about her wrestling career and her reasons for leaving competition. The information was twisted into a narrative about her being a failed athlete who was living vicariously through her husband's success, driving him to adopt dangerous coaching methods that prioritized winning over student safety. Madison Hartwell orchestrated a particularly vicious campaign, targeting Jess's work at the physical therapy clinic. Fake reviews appeared online, questioning her professional competence and suggesting that her treatment methods were unnecessarily aggressive. Anonymous complaints were filed with the state licensing board, forcing Jess to spend time and resources defending against allegations that had no basis in reality but could seriously damage her career if not addressed properly. The financial pressure intensified as local businesses aligned with the Brennan family interests found new ways to isolate wrestling families economically. Insurance rates increased for families whose children participated in wrestling, supposedly due to the sport's high injury rates. Scholarship opportunities that had been promised to graduating seniors were suddenly re-evaluated based on new criteria that effectively excluded wrestling participants. Even basic services like equipment repairs and facility maintenance became more expensive or unavailable for wrestling-related needs. Dr. Foster's position became increasingly untenable as pressure mounted from multiple directions simultaneously. Board members questioned her leadership ability, parents demanded action on safety concerns that were largely fabricated, and community leaders expressed disappointment in her failure to maintain harmony within the school environment. Her attempts to defend Coach Martinez were interpreted as evidence of poor judgment and possible favoritism that called her overall competence into question. The wrestling team members found themselves fighting battles on multiple fronts as academic pressure, social isolation, and family stress combined to create an overwhelming environment of hostility. Several wrestlers began questioning whether their continued participation was worth the personal cost, exactly the outcome Tyler's campaign was designed to achieve. The team unity that had been Coach Martinez's greatest strength was fracturing under sustained assault from opponents who understood that demoralization was more effective than direct confrontation. Community meetings about the upcoming festival became forums for expressing orchestrated concerns about wrestling's presence at school events. Parents who had been recruited by Tyler's supporters questioned whether demonstrations of wrestling techniques were appropriate for family-friendly gatherings, suggesting that the sport's aggressive nature might traumatize younger children or create liability issues for the school district. The local media coverage reflected the narrative that Tyler's campaign had successfully established, with stories about wrestling-related incidents receiving prominent placement, while positive achievements were either ignored or presented in ways that minimized their significance. The weekly newspaper's coverage of festival preparations focused heavily on football activities and traditional school programs, while treating wrestling demonstrations as controversial additions that might not be suitable for community events. Tyler's personal behavior became increasingly erratic as the festival approached, and the pressure of maintaining his carefully constructed image while executing his father's strategic plans took its psychological toll. His academic performance declined further as he devoted more time and energy to coordinating attacks on the wrestling program, creating additional stress from teachers and administrators who expected him to maintain minimum standards despite his extracurricular activities. The relationship between Tyler and Madison became more strained as the demands of their coordinated campaign created friction between their personal desires and strategic necessities. Madison's natural inclination toward social dominance aligned with Tyler's goals, but her methods were sometimes too obvious or cruel for the sophisticated political operation his father was orchestrating. Their disagreements about tactics became a source of internal conflict that added unpredictability to their already volatile partnership. Chase Morgan and Ryan Foster, Tyler's primary lieutenants in the harassment campaign, began showing signs of concern about the escalating nature of their activities. What had started as typical teenage social conflict was evolving into something more serious and potentially criminal, creating legal and social risks that exceeded their comfort levels. Their growing reluctance to participate in Tyler's more extreme plans created additional pressure on him to achieve decisive victory quickly. The wrestling team's parents organized a support group that met secretly to discuss strategies for protecting their children and defending Coach Martinez's program. The need for secrecy in discussing support for a high school athletics program illustrated how effectively Tyler's campaign had intimidated the community and created an atmosphere where expressing dissent carried real social and economic risks. Sarah Henderson's access to school administrative information provided crucial intelligence about the timing and nature of the planned board review of David's position. The agenda items had been carefully crafted to appear objective and procedural, while actually serving as vehicles for presenting the case against his continued employment. Tom Brennan's political experience was evident in the sophisticated language and strategic timing of the formal challenge to David's coaching position. The festival preparations became a battlefield where competing visions of Millbrook's identity played out through seemingly innocuous decisions about event programming and space allocation. The wrestling team's demonstration booth was repeatedly moved to less prominent locations. Their time slots were reduced, and their equipment requests were delayed or denied based on budget constraints that mysteriously didn't affect other programs. Tyler's supporters began arriving at school events in coordinated groups, wearing clothing and displaying signs that promoted football while subtly denigrating wrestling and other programs. Their presence was carefully managed to appear spontaneous, while actually representing organized political theater designed to influence community opinion and demonstrate Tyler's popular support. The pressure on Jess reached a personal breaking point when someone left threatening messages on her clinic voicemail, warning her about the consequences of continuing to support her husband's dangerous coaching methods. The messages were untraceable and technically didn't cross legal thresholds for harassment, but their timing and content made clear that Tyler's campaign had evolved beyond social pressure into genuine intimidation. David's attempts to address the escalating situation through proper administrative channels were systematically frustrated by bureaucratic delays and procedural obstacles that prevented effective response to the coordinated attacks. His faith in institutional fairness and his commitment to ethical behavior were being exploited by opponents who recognized no such constraints in their pursuit of his destruction. The Eagle Pride Festival emerged as the inevitable climax of months of building tension, the public arena where Tyler would attempt to deliver the decisive blow that would justify his father's political maneuvering and establish his own dominance permanently. The festival's community-wide attendance and informal atmosphere would provide perfect conditions for creating the kind of dramatic incident that could be used to support administrative action against Coach Martinez. Jess recognized that Tyler's psychological needs and his father's political strategy were converging on a confrontation that would force her to choose between protecting her family through continued passive resistance or taking more direct action to defend against opponents who had demonstrated no respect for ethical boundaries. Her competitive background had taught her to recognize the moment when defensive strategies became inadequate and more aggressive tactics became necessary for survival. The systematic nature of the attacks against her family had revealed both the sophistication of their opponents and the limitations of conventional responses to coordinated political warfare. Tyler's campaign had successfully isolated potential supporters through intimidation while building justification for institutional action through manufactured evidence and strategic manipulation of community opinion. As the festival approached, Jess began preparing mentally for the possibility that Tyler's planned confrontation would force her to reveal capabilities that she had hoped to keep hidden forever. Her research into his psychology and methods had convinced her that he was building toward a public humiliation that would serve both his personal need for dominance and his father's political strategy for eliminating the wrestling program. The Eagle Pride Festival dawned with perfect autumn weather that seemed to mock the underlying tension gripping Millbrook's leadership and wrestling families. Tyler Brennan arrived early with his core supporters, claiming strategic positions throughout the festival grounds and preparing for what everyone sensed would be the decisive confrontation in his campaign against Coach Martinez and everything the wrestling program represented. Jess understood that the carefully constructed facade of community harmony was about to shatter permanently, and that her response to Tyler's planned attack would determine not just her family's future in Millbrook, but the broader question of whether privilege and coordination could permanently silence merit and integrity in their adopted community. The morning's deceptive calm was merely the prelude to a confrontation that would force everyone present to choose sides in a conflict that had evolved far beyond typical high school athletics rivalry. The stage was set for Tyler Brennan to discover that his carefully researched target possessed capabilities that no amount of political influence or social coordination could neutralize, and that some people's strength became most dangerous precisely when it was most desperately needed. The festival's cheerful atmosphere and family-friendly activities would soon become the backdrop for a confrontation that would permanently alter Millbrook's social landscape and demonstrate the risks of mistaking quiet competence for helpless vulnerability. Tyler's confidence had reached its peak as months of successful manipulation and intimidation convinced him that victory was inevitable and that his planned humiliation of Coach Martinez's wife would provide the final evidence needed to justify his father's political solution to the wrestling program problem. What he couldn't possibly anticipate was that Jessica Martinez had spent years learning to recognize exactly the kind of predatory behavior he represented, and that her response would be calibrated with the precision of someone who understood the difference between necessary force and gratuitous violence. The festival's opening ceremonies began with traditional displays of school spirit and community pride, but underneath the cheerful surface, everyone connected to the wrestling program understood that they were attending what might be Coach Martinez's final public event as Millbrook's wrestling coach. The outcome of the day's confrontations would determine whether Tyler's campaign of systematic harassment had succeeded in destroying a program that represented everything his sense of natural order found threatening. Jess moved through the festival. Crowds with the heightened awareness of someone who understood that conflict was no longer a possibility, but a certainty, observing Tyler's positioning and preparation while maintaining the calm exterior that had served her well throughout months. of escalating pressure. Her competitive experience had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared most confident, and Tyler's obvious anticipation of easy victory suggested that he had never encountered genuine resistance from someone who possessed both the capability and the willingness to provide it. The morning progressed with increasing tension as Tyler's supporters gathered momentum and confidence while wrestling families tried to maintain normal festival participation despite knowing that everything they had worked to build was under immediate threat. The cheerful chaos of community celebration provided perfect cover for Tyler's final preparations to deliver the public humiliation that would serve his psychological needs, while providing his father with the justification needed for administrative action against Coach Martinez. What Tyler failed to understand was that Jessica Martinez had been preparing for this confrontation since the first day his harassment campaign began, and that her response would demonstrate the difference between someone who had earned their strength through years of disciplined training and someone who had inherited their power through family connections and social privilege. The festival's family-friendly atmosphere was about to become the setting for a lesson in the consequences of mistaking kindness for weakness and confusing restraint with inability. The confrontation began with Tyler's characteristic arrogance as he approached the wrestling demonstration booth with his entourage trailing behind like a royal procession. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the festival grounds, and the cheerful sounds of families enjoying carnival games and food trucks created a surreal backdrop for what everyone sensed would be a defining moment in Millbrook's social hierarchy. Jess had been helping David organize wrestling technique cards when she noticed the sudden shift in crowd dynamics that announced Tyler's arrival. His approach was calculated theater, designed to draw maximum attention while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. Tyler wore his Letterman jacket despite the warm weather, a deliberate choice that emphasized his status as Millbrook's golden boy and football star. Madison Hartwell walked beside him in a designer outfit that cost more than most families spent on festival attendance, her phone already positioned to capture whatever humiliation Tyler had planned for the wrestling coach's quiet wife. Chase Morgan and Ryan Foster flanked the group like bodyguards, their bulk and aggressive posture sending clear signals about their readiness to escalate any confrontation that might develop. Behind them, a carefully selected audience of football. Players, cheerleaders, and influential students created the impression of widespread support for whatever Tyler was planning to unleash. The wrestling demonstration had been going exceptionally well before Tyler's arrival, with young athletes and their parents showing genuine interest in the techniques David was explaining. Several middle school students had signed up for information about joining the high school program, and the positive energy around the booth was exactly what Tyler found intolerable about the wrestling team's growing success and community acceptance. David was in the middle of explaining a basic takedown technique to a group of enthusiastic 8th graders when Tyler's voice cut through the afternoon air with deliberate volume and unmistakable hostility. "Hey, Coach Martinez, teaching kids how to hurt each other now? I thought wrestling was supposed to be about discipline and character, not violence and aggression." The accusation was carefully crafted to sound like legitimate concern, while actually serving as an opening attack, designed to put David on the defensive in front of parents and potential wrestling recruits. Tyler's tone carried the practiced sincerity of someone who had spent years learning to manipulate adult perceptions while pursuing teenage vendettas. David responded with the professional composure that had served him well throughout months of escalating harassment, explaining that wrestling emphasized control, technique, and safety above all else. His calm response only seemed to fuel Tyler's aggression, as the quarterback had clearly hoped to provoke a defensive reaction that would support his narrative about the wrestling program's negative influence on school culture. The crowd around the wrestling booth began to grow as word spread that something significant was developing between Tyler Brennan and Coach Martinez. Cell phones appeared in hands throughout the gathering audience, with students and adults alike recognizing that they might be witnessing the climactic confrontation that had been building for months. Tyler's tactics escalated as his initial approach failed to achieve the desired reaction from David. He began questioning the safety of wrestling techniques, suggesting that parents should be concerned about sending their children to participate in a program that emphasized physical dominance over academic achievement. His comments were designed to plant seeds of doubt while positioning himself as a concerned student leader, protecting younger athletes from potentially harmful influences. Madison contributed to the performance by expressing mock concern about the appropriateness of wrestling demonstrations at a family-friendly event, suggesting that displays of aggressive physical techniques might be traumatic for younger children or unsuitable for the festival's positive atmosphere. Her comments were delivered with the practiced concern of someone who had spent years learning to disguise cruelty as compassion. Jess watched the performance unfold with the detached observation of someone who understood exactly what was happening and why. Tyler's psychology was transparent to anyone who had experience with competitive environments where mental warfare was as important as physical preparation. He needed public victory to maintain his self-image and social position, and he had chosen this moment and location because he believed the constraints of the family-friendly environment would prevent any effective response to his attack. The wrestling team members who were present began to show signs of distress as Tyler's assault on their coach and program intensified. Kevin Rodriguez clenched his fists while fighting to maintain the discipline Coach Martinez had taught about controlling emotions during confrontation. Marcus Williams stepped closer to his teammates, recognizing that Tyler's attack was designed to provoke exactly the kind of reaction that would justify administrative action against the wrestling program. Tyler's confidence grew as he sensed that his attack was achieving its intended effect of putting the wrestling program's supporters on the defensive while positioning himself as the reasonable voice of community concern. His years of successful manipulation had convinced him that combination of social pressure, family influence, and public performance would be sufficient to achieve any goal he set for himself. The moment of escalation came when Tyler decided that verbal assault was insufficient to achieve the dramatic victory he required. His psychological profile demanded physical dominance to satisfy his need for complete control, and the family-friendly environment that was supposed to constrain him actually provided the perfect cover for an assault that would appear accidental or playful to casual observers, while devastating its target personally and professionally. Jess had been standing slightly apart from the main group, organizing equipment and trying to remain inconspicuous while supporting David's demonstration. Her position made her an ideal target for Tyler's planned escalation, isolated enough to be vulnerable, but visible enough to ensure maximum humiliation for both her and her husband. Tyler's approach toward Jess was casual and seemingly innocent, designed to appear like friendly interaction to observers who weren't paying close attention to the underlying dynamics. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who had never encountered effective resistance, his smile conveying the predatory satisfaction of someone who was about to achieve long-anticipated revenge against perceived enemies. "Mrs. Martinez," Tyler said with exaggerated politeness, "I've been meaning to ask you about your background in wrestling. I heard you used to compete before you moved to Millbrook. Must be nice to live through your husband's success after your own career didn't work out the way you planned." The personal attack was designed to establish psychological dominance while creating emotional vulnerability that Tyler could exploit in the next phase of his assault. His research into Jess's background had provided ammunition for exactly the kind of intimate humiliation that was most difficult to defend against in public settings. Jess's response was calm and professional, acknowledging her wrestling background, while refusing to engage with Tyler's obvious attempts at provocation. Her composure seemed to frustrate him, as his experience with intimidation had taught him to expect immediate emotional reactions that he could exploit for further attack. Madison stepped closer to capture better video of what she expected would be Jess's emotional breakdown under Tyler's systematic assault on her personal history and professional competence. The anticipation in her expression revealed how much she was enjoying the psychological torture of another woman who had committed the crime of existing outside their carefully maintained social hierarchy. Tyler's frustration with Jess's controlled response led him to escalate toward the physical assault that his psychology demanded to achieve satisfaction. His years of unchallenged privilege had created expectations about how confrontations should unfold, and Jess's refusal to play her assigned role as victim was creating pressure that he was psychologically equipped to handle. The attack itself was swift and designed to appear accidental to casual observers while achieving maximum humiliation for its target. Tyler reached toward Jess as if extending his hand in friendly greeting, then deliberately stumbled forward in a way that would allow him to grab at her clothing while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. His hand caught the hem of Jess's khaki skirt and pulled upward with vicious force, the fabric tearing easily as Tyler's momentum and deliberate effort combined to expose her in front of hundreds of community members. The sound of ripping fabric was clearly audible to the immediate crowd, followed by gasps and nervous laughter from teenagers who recognized the sexual nature of the assault, but were too immature to understand its serious implications. For one frozen moment, Jess stood completely still as Tyler's triumphant grin spread across his face, and Madison's phone captured what they expected would be viral footage of the wrestling coach's wife being humiliated in the most degrading way possible. The torn skirt hung awkwardly, exposing the athletic shorts she wore underneath as protection against exactly this kind of attack. What Tyler and his supporters failed to recognize was that Jess's stillness was not shock or humiliation, but the momentary calm that preceded explosive action. Her competitive experience had taught her to recognize the exact moment when restraint became counterproductive and decisive force became necessary for survival. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The quiet physical therapist who had been trying to remain invisible while supporting her husband's wrestling demonstration disappeared, replaced by someone whose entire body language announced predatory capability and absolute readiness for violence. Years of disciplined training and competitive experience crystallized into perfect awareness of opportunity and overwhelming superiority. Tyler's psychological dominance evaporated the instant he saw Jess's expression change from embarrassed victim to calculating predator. His experience with intimidation had never prepared him for encountering someone who possessed both the capability and willingness to respond to his assault with overwhelming force. "You have exactly 10 seconds to apologize," Jess said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that made everyone within hearing distance stop their conversations and turn their attention toward what was clearly about to become a defining moment in Millbrook's social history. Tyler's response revealed the depth of his psychological delusion about his own invulnerability and the extent to which his privileged background had insulated him from the natural consequences of his behavior. Instead of recognizing the danger he was facing, he interpreted Jess's warning as an empty threat from someone too weak and constrained by social expectations to pose any real challenge to his dominance. Or what? Tyler laughed, looking around at his supporters for validation of his continued dominance over the situation. "You'll report me to the principal? Tell your husband? Face it, Mrs. Martinez, you've got no power here, no influence, no protection, no way to make me do anything I don't want to do." His psychological need for complete dominance led him to continue the assault even after achieving his initial goal of public humiliation. Tyler reached toward Jess again, intending to complete the degradation by forcing her to retreat or defend herself in ways that would provide additional ammunition for his father's campaign against the wrestling program. The moment Tyler's hand moved toward her, Jess stepped forward instead of backward, closing distance in a way that immediately put her in position to control the encounter completely. Her movement was so smooth and natural that most observers didn't initially recognize it as the beginning of a systematic demonstration of why someone with her background should never be mistaken for an easy target. Tyler's overconfidence and inexperience with genuine resistance made him easy prey for someone who had spent years learning to read opponents and exploit their weaknesses with surgical precision. His telegraphed movements and predictable aggression were exactly the kind of behavior that competitive wrestlers learn to punish instinctively and overwhelmingly. What happened next took less than 30 seconds but would be analyzed and discussed in Millbrook for years afterward. Jess's response to Tyler's assault was a masterclass in controlled violence, demonstrating the difference between someone who had earned their capabilities through years of disciplined training and someone who had inherited their power through family connections and social privilege. The first technique was a simple redirecting of Tyler's momentum that sent him stumbling past her while she maintained perfect balance and control. The movement looked almost effortless, but its psychological impact was devastating as Tyler realized that his physical advantages of size and strength were completely neutralized by Jess's superior technique and preparation. His attempt to recover and reassert dominance resulted in a textbook hip throw that put Tyler flat on his back in front of 800 community members. His expensive Letterman jacket now covered with dust and grass stains. The throw was executed with the kind of precision that announced years of high-level training, while demonstrating restraint that kept Tyler from serious injury. Madison's horrified gasp was clearly audible as she watched her boyfriend's carefully constructed image of invulnerability shatter in real time. Her phone continued recording, but what she was capturing was the opposite of the humiliation video she had planned to create and share across social media. Chase Morgan and Ryan Foster stepped forward to assist their leader, but Jess's calm, warning about the consequences of interference, made them hesitate just long enough to recognize that they were facing someone whose capabilities far exceeded anything they were prepared to handle. Their brief hesitation was enough for other festival attendees to position themselves where any escalation would be clearly visible and recorded from multiple angles. Tyler's attempt to get back on his feet resulted in another demonstration of Jess's overwhelming technical superiority as she controlled his movement and balance with the casual ease of someone who had spent years mastering the art of human leverage and control. Each technique was applied with just enough force to be effective, while avoiding the kind of serious injury that would create legal complications. The crowd's reaction evolved from shocked silence to amazed murmuring as people began to understand what they were witnessing. Parents who had been concerned about wrestling's supposedly violent nature were seeing a demonstration of how proper technique and training could be used for protection rather than aggression, while students were learning that privilege and social status provided no protection against superior skill and preparation. Tyler's psychological collapse was as complete as his physical defeat. The young man who had spent months systematically terrorizing wrestling team members and their families was reduced to begging for mercy in front of the entire community, his carefully constructed image of dominance permanently shattered by someone he had dismissed as weak and helpless. "Please," Tyler gasped from his position on the ground, all pretense of superiority abandoned as he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Please stop, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Please just let me go." Jess maintained control for several more seconds, allowing Tyler to fully experience helplessness while ensuring that every camera captured his complete submission. Her release of the hold was as controlled and precise as its application, demonstrating that his defeat was the result of her choice rather than his resistance or escape. Standing over Tyler's prone form, Jess addressed the crowd with the same calm voice she had used to warn him about the consequences of his assault. "Wrestling is about discipline, respect, and using strength to protect rather than harm. Today, my husband's program taught this young man some important lessons about all three principles." The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a chaos of cell phone videos, excited conversations, and the rapid spread of news about what had just occurred at the Eagle Pride Festival. Within minutes, footage of Tyler Brennan's humiliation was circulating throughout Millbrook and beyond, creating a viral moment that would permanently alter the community's social dynamics and power structures. Madison's attempt to spin the incident as an unprovoked attack quickly collapsed when multiple camera angles revealed the clear sequence of Tyler's assault and Jess's defensive response. Her own video, which she had intended to use for Tyler's glorification, instead provided the clearest evidence of his aggressive behavior and complete defeat. Dr. Foster arrived within minutes of the confrontation, having been alerted by security personnel who had heard about the disturbance. Her assessment of the situation was complicated by the obvious evidence of Tyler's assault and the overwhelming witness support for Jess's right to defend herself against unwanted physical contact. Tom Brennan's appearance at the festival created additional drama as the mayor struggled to manage the political implications of his son's public humiliation while maintaining his carefully constructed image as a community leader. His attempts to control the narrative were frustrated by the viral nature of the video evidence and the clear documentation of Tyler's aggressive behavior. The wrestling team members who had witnessed the confrontation experienced a mixture of relief, vindication, and amazement as they watched someone finally hold Tyler accountable for months of harassment and intimidation. Their respect for Coach Martinez was now matched by genuine admiration for his wife's courage and capability in defending their program and their dignity. Community reaction to the incident revealed long-suppressed frustrations with Tyler's behavior and his family's influence over Millbrook's institutions. Parents who had been afraid to speak out against the Brennan family's dominance found courage in Jess's example, while students who had been targets of Tyler's harassment felt empowered to share their own experiences publicly. The emergency school board meeting that had been scheduled to review Coach Martinez's position was quietly cancelled as board members recognized that the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Tyler's public humiliation had eliminated the community support that Tom Brennan needed to execute his plan for removing the wrestling program's leadership. Local media coverage of the incident was overwhelmingly supportive of Jess's actions, with editorials praising her restraint and skill while questioning how Tyler's behavior had been allowed to escalate without previous intervention. The narrative that the Brennan family had carefully constructed about wrestling's negative influence on school culture was completely undermined by the demonstration of how proper training could be used for protection rather than aggression. The long-term consequences of the confrontation extended far beyond the immediate participants. Tyler's social status never recovered from the public demonstration of his vulnerability, while his father's political influence was permanently damaged by the revelation of his family's role in systematic harassment of school personnel and students. Jess became an unexpected leader in Millbrook's transformation, using her newfound prominence to establish self-defense programs and anti-bullying initiatives that address the underlying power imbalances that had allowed Tyler's behavior to persist unchecked. Her example inspired other community members to challenge established hierarchies and demand accountability from privileged individuals who had previously operated without effective oversight. The wrestling program flourished under the protection of Jess's newfound status as a community hero, with enrollment increasing dramatically as parents recognized the positive values and practical skills that proper martial arts training could provide their children. David's coaching philosophy of discipline, respect, and controlled strength became a model for other programs throughout the region. Tyler's eventual departure from Millbrook for a private school in another state marked the end of an era in the community's social development. His removal eliminated the primary source of institutional harassment while creating space for more inclusive and merit-based approaches to student leadership and community recognition. The transformation of Millbrook's culture in the months following the Eagle Pride Festival confrontation demonstrated how individual courage could catalyze broader social change when supported by community members who had been waiting for someone to challenge entrenched privilege and systematic abuse of power. Jess's decision to defend herself had created ripple effects that improved life for countless other people who had been suffering in silence under Tyler's regime of intimidation. The incident also served as a powerful lesson about the dangers of mistaking quiet competence for weakness and assuming that privilege and social connections could protect someone from the natural consequences of predatory behavior. Tyler's humiliation became a cautionary tale that influenced behavior throughout the region, as other privileged young people reconsidered their own approaches to social dominance and conflict resolution. Years later, the Eagle Pride Festival confrontation was still remembered as a defining moment in Millbrook's history, the day when a quiet physical therapist demonstrated that true strength came from discipline, training, and the courage to use one's capabilities in defense of dignity and justice, rather than for personal aggrandizement or social dominance. The weeks following the Eagle Pride Festival transformed Millbrook in ways that no one could have anticipated. The viral footage of Tyler Brennan's humiliation had spread far beyond their small Pennsylvania community, reaching national audiences hungry for stories about bullies receiving their comeuppance and underdogs finding their strength. Jessica Martinez became an unlikely internet sensation, her calm professionalism in the face of assault inspiring countless viewers who had faced similar situations without the training or courage to respond effectively. The immediate aftermath at the festival had been chaotic but decisive. Security personnel arrived to find Tyler still on the ground, his expensive Letterman jacket torn and dirty, while Jess stood nearby, adjusting her clothing with the same methodical precision she brought to her physical therapy work. The crowd that had gathered maintained respectful distance, their expressions ranging from amazement to vindication as they processed what they had witnessed. Dr. Foster's assessment of the situation was complicated by the overwhelming evidence, supporting Jess's right to self-defense and the community's obvious approval of her actions. Multiple camera angles had captured Tyler's deliberate assault and Jess's controlled response, making any attempt to blame her for the confrontation legally and politically impossible. The principal found herself in the unusual position of having to protect a community member who had demonstrated capabilities that most people associated with professional law enforcement or military training. Tom Brennan's arrival created additional tension as the mayor struggled to balance his parental instincts with his political survival. His carefully constructed campaign against the wrestling program had collapsed in spectacular fashion, and his son's behavior had created exactly the kind of public relations disaster that could end political careers in small communities where reputation mattered more than party affiliation or policy positions. The mayor's attempts to control the narrative were hampered by the viral nature of the video evidence and the community's obvious relief at finally seeing Tyler held accountable for behavior that had been tolerated for too long. Parents who had been afraid to speak out against the Brennan family's influence found courage in Jess's example, sharing stories about their own children's experiences with Tyler's harassment and intimidation. Madison Hartwell's social media empire crumbled as her own footage provided the clearest evidence of Tyler's assault and subsequent humiliation. Her attempts to delete the videos were frustrated by users who had already downloaded and reshared the content, creating a permanent record of the incident that would follow both her and Tyler for years to come. The mean girl who had built her status on tearing down others found herself becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of documenting your own bad behavior. Chase Morgan and Ryan Foster faced their own reckonings as their association with Tyler's harassment campaign became public knowledge. Parents who had trusted them with leadership positions in various school activities began questioning their judgment and character, while college recruiters who had been interested in their athletic abilities reconsidered their scholarship offers based on documented evidence of their participation in systematic bullying. The wrestling team members experienced a mixture of vindication and amazement as they watched months of harassment and intimidation finally receive appropriate consequences. Kevin Rodriguez found his chemistry grades mysteriously improving as his teacher suddenly became more flexible about group project assignments, while Marcus Williams discovered that his work schedule at the restaurant returned to normal without explanation or acknowledgement of the previous problems. Community meetings that had been scheduled to discuss Tyler's manufactured concerns about wrestling's impact on school culture were transformed into celebrations of the program's positive influence and discussions about expanding anti-bullying initiatives throughout the district. Parents who had been recruited to question Coach Martinez's methods instead shared stories about the positive changes they had observed in their children since joining the wrestling team. The school board meeting that was supposed to review David's coaching position became an opportunity for community members to express their support for the wrestling program and their concerns about how Tyler's behavior had been allowed to persist without meaningful intervention. Board members who had been prepared to discuss budget cuts and program elimination instead found themselves defending their failure to address obvious harassment and explaining why they had been influenced by the Brennan family's political pressure. Jess's overnight celebrity status brought interview requests from national media outlets interested in her story and her background in competitive wrestling. Her calm, articulate responses to questions about self-defense and standing up to bullies resonated with audiences who had their own experiences with harassment and intimidation, making her an unlikely spokesperson for personal empowerment and community accountability. The physical therapy clinic where Jess worked experienced a surge in business as community members sought her services and wanted to support someone who had demonstrated such courage and integrity. Her professional reputation, which had been targeted by Tyler's supporters, was now enhanced by public recognition of her skills and character, creating opportunities for expansion and specialization that had previously seemed impossible. David's wrestling program became a model for other schools throughout the region as educators and coaches sought to understand how his methods had produced not only successful athletes, but also young people capable of standing up to bullying and harassment. His emphasis on discipline, respect, and controlled strength was recognized as exactly the kind of character development that schools claimed to promote but often failed to achieve. The transformation of Millbrook's social dynamics extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the entire community's approach to privilege, accountability, and social justice. Students who had been afraid to report harassment found courage to speak up, while teachers and administrators who'd been reluctant to challenge influential families began enforcing rules and policies more consistently, regardless of the perpetrator's social status. Local businesses that had been pressured to participate in the economic harassment of wrestling families reversed their policies and began actively supporting the program through sponsorships and partnerships. The financial pressure that had been building against Coach Martinez's supporters evaporated as community sentiment shifted decisively in favor of the wrestling program and its leadership. Tyler's social media presence, which had been carefully curated to present him as Millbrook's golden boy, became a liability as users found and shared examples of his previous harassment and intimidation tactics. College recruiters who had been interested in his athletic abilities began distancing themselves from a player whose character issues had become nationally visible through viral video footage. The incident's impact on Tyler personally was profound and lasting. The young man who had built his identity around social dominance and physical intimidation found himself isolated and powerless, experiencing for the first time the vulnerability and helplessness that he had inflicted on others for years. His psychological adjustment to this new reality proved difficult, requiring professional counseling and eventual relocation to a different community where his reputation hadn't been permanently damaged. Madison's attempt to rebuild her social media following by positioning herself as a reformed mean girl seeking redemption was met with skepticism from audiences who had seen her gleeful participation in Tyler's harassment campaign. Her carefully constructed image as Millbrook's premier teenage socialite never recovered from the association with Tyler's humiliation and her role in documenting his assault on Jess. The broader implications of the incident extended to discussions about privilege, accountability, and the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable members from systematic harassment. Jess's example inspired similar confrontations in other communities where bullies had been operating with impunity, creating a ripple effect of accountability that affected young people throughout the region. Educational institutions began incorporating the Millbrook incident into their anti-bullying curricula, using the video footage and subsequent developments as examples of how individual courage could catalyze broader social change. Jess's calm professionalism in defending herself became a model for how people could stand up to harassment while maintaining their dignity and legal protection. The wrestling program's success continued to grow as enrollment increased dramatically, and the team's competitive performance improved under the protection of their new community status. College recruiters who had previously overlooked Millbrook wrestlers began attending matches and offering scholarships, recognizing that Coach Martinez's methods were producing not only skilled athletes, but also young people with exceptional character and integrity. Jess's decision to establish a self-defense program for community members created opportunities for people throughout Millbrook to learn practical skills for protecting themselves while building confidence and physical fitness. Her classes attracted participants ranging from teenage girls seeking protection from harassment to elderly residents wanting to feel safer in their daily activities. The program's emphasis on situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and controlled defensive responses reflected Jess's philosophy that physical skills should be used for protection rather than aggression. Her teaching methods, which emphasized respect for opponents and restraint in the use of force, created a learning environment that attracted families who might have been reluctant to participate in traditional martial arts programs. Dr. Foster's handling of the incident aftermath enhanced her reputation as an administrator who could manage complex situations fairly and effectively. Her decision to support Jess's right to self-defense while implementing policies to prevent future harassment demonstrated leadership qualities that earned respect from both staff and community members. The incident also created opportunities for broader discussions about gender roles, physical capabilities, and societal expectations about how women should respond to assault and harassment. Jess's example challenged stereotypes about feminine behavior, while demonstrating that strength and compassion were not mutually exclusive qualities. Tom Brennan's political career never fully recovered from the association with his son's behavior and his own role in the harassment campaign against the wrestling program. His attempts to distance himself from Tyler's actions were undermined by evidence of his coordination and support for efforts to remove Coach Martinez from his position. The mayor, who had once seemed destined for higher office, found himself struggling to maintain local support and credibility. The incident's long-term impact on Millbrook's culture was evident in the community's approach to athletic programs, student discipline, and social hierarchy. The assumption that certain families deserved special treatment regardless of their behavior was permanently challenged, creating space for more merit-based and inclusive approaches to leadership and recognition. Years later, the Eagle Pride Festival confrontation was still studied by sociologists and educators interested in how individual actions could transform community dynamics and challenge entrenched power structures. Jess's decision to defend herself had created a case study in personal empowerment and social change that influenced discussions about bullying prevention and community accountability throughout the region. The wrestling team that had been under attack became a source of pride for Millbrook, with their success in competition matched by their reputation for character and integrity. Former wrestlers who went on to college and careers carried with them the lessons they had learned about standing up for what was right and supporting teammates through difficult challenges. Jess's transformation from quiet physical therapist to community leader demonstrated how circumstances could reveal capabilities and character that might otherwise remain hidden. Her example inspired other community members to step forward when they witnessed injustice or harassment, creating a culture where accountability was expected rather than optional. The incident also served as a powerful reminder about the importance of not judging people based on their appearance, occupation, or social status. Tyler's assumption that Jess would be an easy target because she seemed quiet and unassuming proved to be one of the most expensive mistakes of his young life, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate physical confrontation. The viral nature of the video footage ensured that the lesson reached audiences far beyond Millbrook, inspiring people throughout the country who had faced similar situations but lacked the training or confidence to respond effectively. Jess's calm professionalism in defending herself became a model for how people could stand up to harassment while maintaining their legal and moral authority. The transformation of Millbrook from a community where privilege could shield harmful behavior to one where accountability was expected regardless of social status represented a fundamental shift in values and expectations that continued to influence local culture long after the immediate participants had moved on with their lives. Tyler's eventual departure for boarding school in another state marked the end of an era in Millbrook's social development, but the changes his behavior had catalyzed continued to shape the community's approach to leadership, discipline, and social justice. His absence created space for student leaders who were chosen based on character and contribution rather than family connections and athletic ability. The incident's impact on discussions about self-defense, particularly for women facing harassment, and assault extended far beyond Millbrook to influence policy discussions and educational curricula throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Jess's example provided concrete evidence that proper training could enable effective self-defense while maintaining legal protection and moral authority. The wrestling program that had been under systematic attack became a model for other schools. Seeking to build character and discipline through athletic participation, Coach Martinez's methods, which emphasized respect, control, and the responsible use of strength, attracted attention from educators who recognized the positive impact on student behavior and academic performance. The community's response to the incident demonstrated how individual courage could inspire broader social change when supported by people who had been waiting for someone to challenge injustice but lacked the capability or opportunity to act themselves. Jess's decision to defend herself created ripple effects that improved conditions for countless other community members who had been suffering in silence. The lasting legacy of the Eagle Pride Festival confrontation was not just Tyler's humiliation or Jess's vindication, but the demonstration that communities could transform themselves when individuals found the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost or social pressure to remain silent and compliant. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.